It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This month, I've decided that it's time to look at some other Toho monsters. 3 of these monsters get their first appearance in their own movies, and 2 of them will eventually get a chance to show up in a later Godzilla film. The 4th movie features a particularly recognizable monster who got into a Godzilla movie first before Toho decided to make another movie with him. And that's if you don't count his own very successful solo films that basically introduced the world to that monster. But if we're talking specifically Toho, that 4th movie is going to have a little bit of a sequel after first appearing in a Godzilla movie. But the main outlier of the month is a creature that will appear in this week's movie, Gorath. Now, the film was released in Japan as Calamity Star Gorath on March 21st, 1962, and that's the literal translation of the title from Japan. But our monster is a walrus-looking reptile creature that's named Maguma that is awoken in Antarctica during the 3rd act of this movie. Now, originally, Gorath was not going to include a kaiju, but Toho executives felt it was necessary to have a monster show up in a tokusatsu film that featured Eiji Tsuburaya special effects. And originally, director Ishiro Honda was not really into the idea of featuring a creature in this. And the way it kind of plays out, it really does kind of feel extra shoehorned in the long run. But I suppose when the execs at the production company that is footing the bill for the movie say they want something like a monster in it, well, I guess you're going to put that monster into the movie. And the script only said that Maguma was a dinosaur. It was the special effects people who built the creature that ultimately decided that this creature should be a walrus like reptile. Now, Maguma never appeared in a later Godzilla movie. Several creatures who had solo films at Toho would later appear either as a co-star or as a cameo, especially in a movie that we've yet to cover, which is Destroy All Monsters. And we'll get to that a little bit later this year, I'm sure. But a lot of Toho monsters appeared in that film because originally that was kind of meant to be the grand finale of the Toho kaiju films. And again, we'll talk about that more when we actually cover that movie. But neither Maguma nor Magra, who we saw previously in The Mysterians, appeared in Destroy All Monsters, though the latter would appear in a much later Toho Godzilla film in the Millennium era. Now, originally, Maguma did have a part with another monster that was, for that Destroy All Monster script, and that other monster we'll see in a couple of weeks. But in later iterations of that script, Maguma was cut with a few other monsters that were also originally supposed to appear in Destroy All Monsters. Now, while Maguma would only appear in this film, he does appear in an episode of the internet series called Gazaban, and kind of shows up with some of the other Toho monsters in that series. But our titular object, Gorath, that's a stray celestial body. And basically in this film, it's a star that's on a collision course with Earth. Over 40 years later, it would be mentioned again in Godzilla Final Wars when the evil Zillions arrive on Earth and claim that Gorath is a giant runaway planet that will soon collide with Earth, and they want to help prevent that. However, members of the Earth Defense Force discover that the image of Gorath being shown to the world was simply a hologram, and the Zillions were no good dirty liars. But as for our movie, our tale opens in September 1979, and maybe that's why it's hard to fit Maguma into a later Godzilla film, because this actually takes place in the future of all of those movies except for Destroy All Monsters. But at the Mount Fuji station of the Interstellar Exploration Agency, a new rocket called the JX-1 is launched, and it's crewed by a 30-member team and led by a man who is on the way to Saturn on a 9-month exploratory mission. And 3 months later, they learn a star that's been called Gorath has been on a rogue trajectory and passing nearby. And they're diverted to explore this star because it has a mass of 6,000 times that of Earth's and could be pretty bad if it continues on its path. However, the crew of the JX-1 kind of has a hard time intercepting and keeping pace with the traveling celestial body because, well, for some reason, Gorath is continuously speeding up. In addition, there's more bad news. Gorath is pulling the JX-1 into its gravitational field, and it ultimately consumes it by pulling it into itself and destroying it. Later, as the calendar turns over to the new decade of the 1980s, the daughter of the JX-1's commander discovers that her father and all the crew of the ship were killed. But using the information that her father's crew had collected from studying Gorath, astronomers learned that basically Gorath is on a collision course with Earth and will be here in 2 years' time. Now, while some Japanese officials are a little displeased with the JX-1 essentially being sacrificed, that data, like I said, has been studied the world over to find an appropriate defense against this rogue star that is somewhere around 60% of the Earth's size while still being 6,000 times more massive. The key thing is Gorath cannot come within essentially about 400,000 kilometers of the Earth, or they will interact with each other with very dangerous effects. It would be pretty much a mass extinction event for all life if you cut that distance in half. So at the United Nations, some of the Japanese scientists decide to literally move the Earth so that when Gorath gets there, we won't be where we're supposed to be, and it will just simply pass by without incident. But question, how do you move the entire planet? Why, you use heavy atomic energy and build something of a nuclear rocket booster at the South Pole to blast that nuclear energy all over the place and make the Earth move. I'm sure that will not either kill everyone or awaken a fairly irritated prehistoric animal to stomp around and kill everyone. As construction gets underway in Antarctica to put the boosters into the Earth to move the planet away from the approaching Gorath, a massive sinkhole opens up and ruins everything that had been built up to that time, which forces a delay and new plans need to be formed. But meanwhile, out in space, the newly dubbed JX-2 approaches Gorath. As Gorath has been traveling across the solar system, it's collected other items and bodies, making the gravity and mass of the rogue star larger than it was during the engagement with the JX-1. Capsule 1, a small craft launched from JX-2, is sent to observe Gorath, but the mass and the gravity around it basically flings debris at the capsule and destroys one of its rocket boosters and really kind of messes with the pilot's head, and that becomes a whole dramatic storyline with some of the characters as well. But back at the Antarctica base, all of that stuff that's being put together for the Earth-moving rockets is attacked by Maguma, which is, again, a prehistoric creature sleeping deep into like this crevice in the Earth. And it's been disturbed and awoken by the activity there. And Maguma is lured to the base whenever the boosters are ignited to move Earth's position. It's irritated that the boosters are unnaturally changing the climate of Antarctica by raising the temperature. And if you think about that, this is a little bit of a kind of a funny thing that happens in this movie, because Maguma becomes this monster that has to be dealt with. However, it's there to be dealt with because people are affecting its climate. And yet, in order to deal with it, they send out a plane with a laser to try to bury Maguma under a ton of rocks. And as to be expected, that doesn't stop Meguma. So now we have something in space on a collision course with the planet and a prehistoric monster walrus really irritated by humans messing with the temperatures of its home. Not to mention, we're trying to move the planet, which will have all sorts of not great effects on our environment. But ultimately, it's decided that the only thing they can do to deal with Meguma is to do a second attack with the laser, and it successfully kills the poor beast who only wanted its habitat to be left alone. It's a really bizarre subplot. And like I said, it is something that makes the inclusion of Meguma feel really shoehorned in. But it's really weird because there's a whole thing about how we affect our own environment that is just completely and totally glossed over, as a lot of things in the final act are, but that's beside the point. It's just a very odd subplot that goes on in this that is not great. But anyway, back in space, the JX-2 has been recalled to Earth, and this is basically to prevent Gorath from absorbing it and gaining more mass as it continues to traverse the solar system. As Gorath passes Saturn, it sucks up the planet's rings. And before long, it's traveling so fast that the rogue star is now visible in Earth's sky. And this also begins to wreak havoc on the planet as tides, winds, storms, all of that stuff begins to kick up. But maybe the worst thing it could possibly do, it does. And that is, it destroys the moon. Yeah, Gorath obliterates and absorbs the moon's mass. That would have unimaginable effects on our planet and its ability to sustain life as we know it. The moon's destruction immediately creates massive tidal waves that starts to pound Japan. The Earth is saved by the boosters being able to successfully move the planet out of the way of Gorath as it passes by. But the moon is gone. The moon is destroyed in this movie, and everybody's happy that, hey, everything's going to go back to normal, right? Well, moving Earth back to its proper place and what life will be like for all living things now that the moon is no longer a thing, just trust me, that's going to be a problem for another time and another movie that's never made. But let's talk about the three things I do like about 1962's Gorath. I will say first up that I really do like how the movie space scenes look. Now, granted, this is a movie that was, it was 1962 when this was made. And so we know what we're seeing is a tiny model of the JX-1 against the starfield background. But, and this might sound funny, the shots of the ships in space, whether it's the JX-1 early on or the JX-2 later, they're not overly lit. Most things in space, particularly in spaces in between planets, will only be able to be lit by two things. The sun, if it's close enough to be lit by the sun, and anything that can reflect the light of the sun, i.e. a planet. Now, even if you're out by Saturn, there will be enough sunlight and reflected light off of Saturn to provide a little bit of a light source, but it's not going to be super bright. That also helps integrate obvious models and background star fields to look a little better than fake models and stars in our brains. Plus, you have this approaching Gorath object. It's not a bright or reflective surface, but there's something glowing red in the star because it's kind of like it's like a dwarf star that's burned out, basically. But that red glow kind of gives the object a little bit of menace. It's a good-looking movie as a whole, and the sci-fi elements were clearly somewhat expensive for Toho, and that should be fairly appreciated. Second, I think it's clear that Gorath was initially made to be something of a science fiction disaster film. This movie features a lot of characters. Some are scientists and officials who talk a lot about the impending doom. There are people who are going to launch in the JX-2 to eventually confront Gorath and observe it. And the movie seems to be meant to be something more than the average Japanese monster flick, because with all of these characters, you have characters who are related to these characters, who are, pondering things with their loved ones, or dealing with the death of their parents in the JX1 disaster and all of that stuff. So remember, it was a later decision to include Meguma, the monster. So it is clear, barring a giant monster thing, that this was kind of intended to be, some sort of a disaster film that we would see so often during the 70s here in the United States, and features slightly more mature conversations, themes, and situations between characters. The group of characters I find most interesting are the younger people who are selected to crew the JX2. They carry themselves as these happy-go-lucky heroes who have almost no assurance that they will suffer a different fate than the crew of the JX1 did. Since we're talking about Toho movies this month, I want to bring up Godzilla Minus One. And in that, there's a younger character who laments that the war didn't last long enough for him to have a chance to fight in World War II. Almost every other character around this guy did go to war, and they're all carrying some sort of massive scars on their souls. And it's an interesting opposite here, where we have people in military dressings partying and excitedly ready to go off to their fate, when it has been historically clear that it's sort of expected that they will die and find that to be the best possible thing they could ever do for the love of their country and national identity as Japanese people. It's just an interesting thing to see it play so differently in this movie than it did, over 60 years later in Godzilla Minus One. Now, third, normally in these types of movies, I would save one of these likes for the creature. Yeah, a reptilian walrus is great and all for Meguma, but he only shows up for literally 5 minutes in this. He's so shoehorned in. But there is a segment where things are being built for these giant nuclear rocket boosters on Antarctica. And it's all miniatures and little radio-controlled vehicles with little plastic guys driving construction vehicles and machinery. It's the exact opposite of the space scenes, and clearly done in a way to show this grand-scale operation on a budget. It's so charming that it doesn't bother me at all that this is obviously something on the level of toys being used to show the construction of the most important thing ever at the South Pole. And it's also kind of neat to see the scale of all these miniatures. And when we do get inserts of actual people working on things in a little closer framing that requires, actual actors and extras to be seen, it's a wonderful composite of the real people working and standing in the foreground with a rear projected action of the little miniatures working away on the construction behind them. It's brilliant, and it's a great way to do that large scale thing, but also be affordable about it. And it really is about the scale of the project and the scale of the things building the project that is just so charming and fascinating to me. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. And don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Next time we go under the sea as we take the Gatingo into the legendary sunken continent of Mu and run into the menace that is Manda in Atragon. Until next week, stay spooky.